This video will record William Butler Yeats's impressions of Oscar Wilde. The two men were only 9 years apart, with Oscar Wilde born in 1854 and Yeats born in 1865. Both were proud Irishmen, both highly educated, both involved in the aesthetic movement and poetry, and Yeats used that poetry to contribute to the Irish literary revival and Celtic Renaissance. People associate Yeats with more modernity than Wilde, but they did move in the same fashionable circles in London. I will be reading from Yeats' 1927 autobiography, which includes a reminiscence of Wilde. It's titled Autobiographies, Reveries Over Childhood and Youth and the Trembling of the Veil. My first meeting with Oscar Wilde was an astonishment. I never before heard a man talking with perfect sentences, as if he had written them all overnight with labor, and yet all spontaneous. There was present that night at Henley's, by right of propinquity or of accident, a man full of the secret spite of dullness, who interrupted from time to time, and always to check or disorder thought, and I noticed with what mastery he was foiled and thrown by Wilde. I noticed, too, that the impression of artificiality that I think all Wilde's listeners have recorded came from the perfect rounding of the sentences and from the deliberation that made it possible. That very impression helped him, as the effective meter, or of the antithetical prose of the 17th century, which is itself a true meter, helped its writers, for he could pass without incongruity from some unforeseen swift stroke of wit to elaborate reverie. I heard him say a few nights later, "Give me the Winter's Tale, daffodils that come before the swallow dare, but not King Lear. What is King Lear but poor life staggering in the fog?" And the slow, carefully modulated cadence sounded natural to my ears. That first night he praised Walter Pater's Studies in the History of the Renaissance. "It is my golden book. I never travel anywhere without it, but it is the very flower of decadence. The last trumpet should have sounded the moment it was written." "But," said the dull man, "would you not have given us time to read it?" "Oh no," was the retort, "there would have been plenty of time afterwards, in either world." I think he seemed to us, baffled as we were by youth or by infirmity, a triumphant figure, and to some of us a figure from another age, an audacious Italian 15th century figure. A few weeks before, I had heard one of my father's friends, an official in a publishing firm that had employed both Wilde and Henley as editors, blaming Henley, who was no use except under control, and praising Wilde, so indolent but such a genius. And now the firm became the topic of our talk. "How often do you go to the office?" said Henley. "I used to go 3 times a week," said Wilde, "for an hour a day, but I have since struck off one of the days." "My God," said Henley, "I went 5 times a week for 5 hours a day, and when I wanted to strike off a day, they had a special committee meeting." "Furthermore," was Wilde's answer, "I never answered their letters. I have known men come to London full of bright prospects and seen them complete wrecks in a few months through a habit of answering letters." He too knew how to keep our elders in their place, and his method was plainly the more successful, for Henley had been dismissed. "No, he is not an aesthete," Henley commented later, being somewhat embarrassed by Wilde's pre-Raphaelite entanglement. "One soon finds that he is a scholar and a gentleman." And when I dined with Wilde a few days afterwards, he began at once, "I had to strain every nerve to equal that man at all, and I was too loyal to speak my thought. You, and not he, said all the brilliant things." He, like the rest of us, had felt the strain of an intensity that seemed to hold life at the point of drama. He had said on that first meeting, "The basis of literary friendship is mixing the poisoned bowl." And for a few weeks Henley and he became close friends, till, the astonishment of their meeting over, diversity of character and ambition pushed them apart, and with half the cavern helping, Henley began mixing the poison bowl for Wilde. Yet Henley never wholly lost their first admiration, for after Wilde's downfall he said to me, "Why did he do it? I told my lads to attack him, and yet we might have fought under his banner." It became the custom, both at Henley's and at Bedford Park, to say that R.A.M. or Bob Stevenson, who frequented both circles, was the better talker. Wilde had been trussed up like a turkey by undergraduates, dragged up and down a hill, his champagne emptied into the ice tub, hooted in the streets of various towns, and I think stoned, and no newspaper named him but in scorn. His manner had hardened to meet opposition, and at times he allowed one to see an unpardonable insolence. His charm was acquired and systematized, a mask, which he wore only when it pleased him, while the charm of Stevenson belonged to him like the color of his hair. If Stevenson's talk became monologue, we did not know it, because our one object was to show by our attention that he need never leave off. I saw a good deal of Wilde at that time. It was the prerogative of youth to take sides, and when Wilde said, "Mr. Bernard Shaw has no enemies but is intensely disliked by all his friends," I knew it to be a phrase I should never forget, and felt revenged upon a notorious hater of romance, whose generosity and courage I could not fathom. Was it 1887 or 1888? I have no way of fixing the date except that I had published my first book, The Wanderings of Oisin, and that Wilde had not yet published his Decay of Lying. He had, before our first meeting, reviewed my book, and despite its vagueness of intention and the inexactness of its speech, praised without qualification, and what was worth more than any review, he had talked about it. And now he asked me to eat my Christmas dinner with him, believing, I imagined, that I was alone in London. He had just renounced his velveteen, and even those cuffs turned backward over the sleeves, and had begun to dress very carefully in the fashion of the moment. He lived in a little house at Chelsea that the architect Godwin had decorated, with an elegance that owed something to Whistler. There was nothing medieval nor pre-Raphaelite, no cupboard door with figures upon flat gold, no peacock blue, no dark background. I remember vaguely a white drawing room with Whistler etchings, let into white panels, and a dining room all white, chairs, walls, mantelpiece, carpet, except for a diamond-shaped piece of red cloth in the middle of the table under a terracotta statuette, and I think a red-shaded lamp hanging from the ceiling to a little above the statuette. It was perhaps too perfect in its unity. His past of a few years before had gone too completely, and I remember thinking that the perfect harmony of his life there, with his beautiful wife and his 2 young children, suggested some deliberate artistic composition. He commended and dispraised himself during dinner by attributing characteristics like his own to his country. We Irish are too poetical to be poets. We are a nation of brilliant failures, but we are the greatest talkers since the Greeks. When dinner was over, he read me from the proofs of The Decay of Lying, and when he came to the sentence, "Schopenhauer has analyzed the pessimism that characterizes modern thought, but Hamlet invented it. The world has become sad because a puppet was once melancholy." I said, "Why do you change sad to melancholy?" He replied that he wanted a full sound at the close of his sentence, and I thought it too elusive and no excuse, and an example of the vague impressiveness that spoiled his writing for me. Only when he spoke, or when his writing was the mirror of his speech, or in some simple fairy tale, had he words exact enough to hold a subtle ear. He alarmed me, though not as Henley did, for I never left his house thinking myself fool or dunce. He flattered the intellect of every man he liked. He made me tell him long Irish stories and compared my art of storytelling to Homer's, and when he had described himself as writing in the censor paper, age 19, profession genius, infirmity talent, the other guest, a young journalist fresh from Oxford or Cambridge, said, "What should I have written?" and was told that it should have been profession talent, infirmity genius. When, however, I called, wearing shoes a little too yellow, unblackened leather had just become fashionable, I realized their extravagance when I saw his eyes fixed upon them, And another day Wilde asked me to tell his little boy a fairy story, and I had but got as far as once upon a time there was a giant, when the little boy screamed and ran out of the room. Wilde looked grave, and I was plunged into the shame of clumsiness that afflicts the young. And when I asked for some literary gossip for some provincial newspaper that paid me a few shillings a month, I was told that writing literary gossip was no job for a gentleman. Though to be compared to Homer passed the time pleasantly, I had not been greatly perturbed had he stopped me with, "Is it a long story?" as Henley would certainly have done. I was abashed before him as wit and man of the world alone. I remember that he deprecated the very general belief in his success or his efficiency, and I think with sincerity. One form of success had gone. He was no more the lion of the season, and he had not discovered his gift for writing comedy. Yet I think I knew him at the happiest moment of his life. No scandal had touched his name. His fame as a talker was growing among his equals, and he seemed to live in the enjoyment of his own spontaneity. One day he began, "I have been inventing a Christian heresy," and he told a detailed story in the style of some early father of how Christ recovered after the crucifixion, and escaping from the tomb lived on for many years, the one man upon earth who knew the falsehood of Christianity. Once St. Paul visited his town, and he alone in the carpenter's quarter did not go to hear him preach. Henceforth the other carpenters noticed that, for some unknown reason, he kept his hands covered. A few days afterwards I found Wilde with smock frocks in various colors spread out upon the floor in front of him, while a missionary explained that he did not object to the heathen going naked upon weekdays, but insisted upon clothes in church. He had brought the smock frocks in a cab, that the only art critic whose fame had reached Central Africa might select a color. So Wilde sat there weighing all with conscious ecclesiastic solemnity. Of late years I have often explained Wilde to myself by his family history. His father was a friend or acquaintance of my father's father, and among my family traditions there is an old Dublin riddle. Why are Sir William Wilde's nails so black? Answer, because he has scratched himself. And there is an old story, still current in Dublin, of Lady Wilde saying to a servant, "Why do you put the plates on the coal scuttle? What are the chairs meant for?" They were famous people, and there are many like stories, and even a horrible folk story, the invention of some Connaught peasant, that tells how Sir William Wilde took out the eyes of some men who had come to consult him as an oculist, and laid them upon a plate, intending to replace them in a moment, and how the eyes were eaten by a cat. As a certain friend of mine, who has made a prolonged study of the nature of cats, said when he first heard the tale, "Cats love eyes." The Wilde family was clearly of the sort that fed the imagination of Charles Lever, dirty, untidy, daring, and what Charles Lever, who loved more normal activities, might not have valued so highly, very imaginative and learned. Lady Wilde, who when I knew her received her friends with blinds down and shutters closed, that none might see her withered face, longed always perhaps, though certainly amid such self-mockery, for some impossible splendor of character and circumstance. She lived near her son in level Chelsea, but I have heard her say, "I want to live on some high place, Primrose Hill or Highgate, because I was an eagle in my youth." I think her son lived with no self-mockery at all, an imaginary life, perpetually performed a play which was in all things the opposite of all that he had known in childhood and early youth, never put off completely his wonder at opening his eyes every morning on his own beautiful house, and in remembering that he had dined yesterday with a duchess, and that he delighted in Flaubert and Pater, read Homer in the original, and not as a schoolmaster reads him for the grammar. I think, too, that because of all that half-civilized blood in his veins, he could not endure the sedentary toil of creative art, and so remained a man of action, exaggerating for the sake of immediate effect every trick learned from his masters, turning their easel painting into painted scenes. He was a parvenu, but a parvenu whose whole bearing proved that if he did dedicate every story in the House of Pomegranates to a lady of title, it was but to show that he was Jack, and the social ladder his pantomime beanstalk. Did you ever hear him say Marquess of Dimmesdale? A friend of his once asked me. He does not say the Duke of York with any pleasure. He told me once that he had been offered a safe seat in Parliament, and had he accepted, he might have had a career like that of Beaconsfield, whose early style resembles his, being meant for crowds, for excitement, for hurried decisions, for immediate triumphs. Such men get their sincerity, if at all, from the contact of events. The dinner table was Wilde's event and made him the greatest talker of his time, and his plays and dialogues have what merit they possess from being now an imitation, now a record of his talk. Even in those days, I would often defend him by saying that his very admiration for his predecessors in poetry, for Browning, for Swinburne, and Rossetti, in their first vogue while he was a very young man, made any success seem impossible that could satisfy his immense ambition. Never but once before had the artist seemed so great, never had the work of art seemed so difficult. I would then compare him with Benvenuto Cellini, who, coming after Michelangelo, found nothing left to do so satisfactory as to turn bravo and quarrel with the man who broke Michelangelo's nose.